She didn't die in front of cameras. She didn't collapse under stage lights. She didn't leave a dramatic final message for the world to decode. She simply went quiet. On the morning of April 30th, 1970, a woman was found on the kitchen floor of her home in the Hollywood Hills. When her name was called, she opened her eyes, lifted her head, and tried to speak, but no sound came out. Minutes later, she was in an ambulance, slipping away between heartbeats as Los Angeles kept moving like nothing had happened. The woman was 35 years old. Her name was Inger Stevens. To the public, she was the kind of beauty Hollywood loved to frame in soft light, elegant, composed, almost untouchable. A familiar face from American television, a rising presence in film, the type of star who looked like she belonged in a black and white photograph that never ages. But that morning, the story didn't look like Hollywood at all. A small bandage, a cut, fresh blood, a scene that felt strangely still, too still. The official conclusion would later point to acute barbiturate poisoning, eventually ruled a suicide. Yet the people who knew her, who heard her laugh, who watched her fight her own shadows, struggled to accept how clean the ending sounded on paper. Because Inger Stevens wasn't a tabloid headline. She was a secret, hiding in plain sight. And Hollywood, as always, loved the smile, but never asked what it cost her to hold it. But that was just the beginning. Inger Stevens, the woman Hollywood couldn't read. Inger Stevens was born in Stockholm, Sweden, in 1934. Her early life was shaped not by glamour, but by instability. Her parents divorced when she was young, and the emotional fracture that followed would quietly define her inner world. As a teenager, she moved to the United States. She spoke with a soft accent, carried herself with restraint, and observed more than she spoke. Unlike many aspiring actresses, Inger did not arrive in Hollywood chasing attention. She arrived searching for structure, perhaps even safety. She studied acting seriously, trained her voice, refined her movements. On screen, she radiated calm. Off screen, she guarded her privacy with precision. Hollywood quickly noticed her presence. Not explosive, not provocative, but magnetic. Casting directors saw in her something rare, a woman who didn't need to perform emotion loudly. The camera came to her. By the late 1950s, Inger Stevens had become a familiar face across America. Television welcomed her into millions of living rooms week after week. She appeared in The Twilight Zone, Route 66, The Farmer's Daughter, roles that required subtlety, intelligence, and emotional control. She worked alongside Clint Eastwood, Anthony Quinn, and other major figures of the era. Critics described her as poised, elegant, and deeply watchable. To the public, she looked composed. To Hollywood, she looked dependable. To the camera, she looked timeless. But behind that stillness, something was breaking. Success, admiration, and the illusion of stability. By the early 1960s, Inger Stevens was living what many would call a dream. She was employed consistently. She was respected professionally. She was admired publicly. She wasn't trapped in typecast roles. She wasn't dismissed as decoration. Instead, she was trusted with characters who carried emotional weight, women with intelligence, vulnerability, and restraint. Hollywood believed she was stable, but stability in Hollywood is often just good acting. Privately, Inger Stevens had begun a battle she never allowed the public to witness. She struggled with severe depression, a condition that intensified as her fame grew. The pressure to maintain an image of calm perfection became suffocating. In an era when mental health was rarely discussed, especially for women in the public eye, silence was the expected solution, and Inger complied. She entered psychiatric care multiple times. She underwent hospitalizations. Some reports suggest electroconvulsive therapy was used, standard practice at the time, but deeply traumatic for many patients. None of this reached the press. Hollywood continued to see a composed actress, producers continued to offer roles, audiences continued to admire her serenity. But inside, the divide between who she was and who she was expected to be was widening. Friends later recalled that Inger carried a profound loneliness. She could be warm, thoughtful, even playful. But there was always a distance, a sense that she was holding something back. She once said she felt like she was watching her own life from the outside. By the late 1960s, despite career momentum, Inger Stevens was exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. She had everything Hollywood promised, yet nothing that made the pain stop. And then came the final months, the final apartment, the final silence, depression, isolation, and the life no one was allowed to see. By the end of the 1960s, Inger Stevens had mastered the art of appearing fine. She attended events. She accepted roles. She smiled when expected. But those closest to her later described a woman living with constant emotional weight, a depression that never fully lifted, only quieted temporarily. Mental health treatment in that era offered little compassion. Privacy was mandatory. Disclosure was dangerous. A woman who admitted weakness risked losing everything. So Inger said nothing. She lived alone by choice, but not by peace. Her apartment was orderly, calm, almost sterile. Friends noted that she preferred evenings at home, silence over noise, control over chaos. Her relationships were intense but fragile. She sought connection, yet feared being truly seen. Love for her was both a refuge and a threat. There were days when she seemed hopeful. There were nights when she disappeared inward. She kept journals. She read extensively. She tried to understand herself in a world that offered her admiration, but not understanding. Hollywood did not ask how she was doing. Hollywood rarely does. The industry only noticed when someone stopped showing up. The apartment, the silence, and the questions left behind. On April 29, 1970, Inger Stevens spent the evening quietly. No public appearances, no dramatic events, nothing that would later explain what followed. Sometime during the night, something went wrong. The next morning, she was discovered in her Hollywood Hills apartment. She was still alive, barely. Witnesses later recalled that she attempted to lift her head. She tried to speak. No words came out. She died shortly afterward. She was 35 years old. Authorities later reported the presence of barbiturates in her system. The official ruling would eventually be suicide by overdose, but the details refused to settle. There was no suicide note. The scene appeared to have been altered before police arrived. The timeline was unclear. The amount of medication raised questions. Most disturbingly, those who knew her well insisted that Inger Stevens was cautious, methodical, not impulsive, not reckless. Her family rejected the idea that she would end her life without explanation. Friends spoke quietly of doubt. Hollywood moved on quickly. There was no prolonged investigation, no public reckoning, no demand for clarity. The story was labeled, filed, forgotten. But the silence around her death felt heavier than any conclusion, because silence in this case explained nothing. What Inger Stevens left behind. Inger Stevens did not die in a scandal. She did not leave behind controversy. She did not become a cautionary headline. She simply vanished. Her films continued to play. Her television appearances remained preserved, smiling, composed, eternal. But the woman behind those images was gone, unresolved. Today, her story resonates more than ever. In an era finally willing to talk about mental health, her life stands as a reminder of what silence can destroy. She was not weak. She was not broken. She was alone. Inger Stevens represents a generation of women taught to endure quietly, to suffer privately, and to never let the cracks show. Hollywood remembered her beauty. History nearly forgot her pain. And perhaps that is the most haunting part. Because some tragedies don't explode. They don't scream. They don't demand attention. They fade quietly, leaving only questions and a stillness that lingers long after the lights go out. Inger Stevens had everything Hollywood promised, and none of what she truly needed.